Based upon my review of the facts of this case, I have determined that the shooting of Andrew Brown on April 21st, 2021 was justified to protect the safety and lives of the deputies on the scene. As tragic as this incident is with the loss of life, the deputies on scene were nonetheless justified in defending themselves from death or great bodily injury. I have shared this conclusion with Sheriff Tommy Wooten and Special Agent in Charge Mache Rogers that no officer will be criminally charged. Once a threat is perceived and the officers fire the first shot, if the first shot is justified, the last shot is justified until the threat is extinguished.
The 3 sheriff deputies who shot and killed Andrew Brown Jr. last month in North Carolina will not face criminal charges. District Attorney Andrew WOMBLE announced today that he will not file charges against the deputies, calling the officers justified in using deadly force against the 42-year-old father of 7. The legal team for Brown's family is calling the decision an attempt to whitewash an unjustified killing. Although the Brown family say their private autopsy shows that he was hit by 5 bullets and killed by a shot to the back of the head, the district attorney today said the autopsy by the state medical examiner's office shows Brown was hit only twice, once in the shoulder and once in the back of the head. Brown's family, which was still only seeing about 20 minutes of the nearly 2 hours of police body cam footage, has described his death as an execution. The sheriff has also just announced the deputies will keep their jobs but be disciplined and retained. Joining me now is President and Senior Lecturer of Repairers of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, Bishop William Barber.
Welcome, Charles. Thank you so much.
WOMBLE was repeatedly pressed today by reporters about his conclusion. I want to play a clip from his press conference today and get you to react on the other side of it.
Once you put the video in motion, it looked like Brown was turning away from the officer.
I'm sorry, your question is?
How do you respond to that?
What was the question?
Are you sure all the facts are in? You said you don't know if the car was decelerating or accelerating.
I know that all of the facts that I needed to make this decision are in.
Reverend Barber, what did you make of this press conference today?
This DA from the very start has acted as though he's the defense lawyer of the deputies and not the lawyer for the people. He has over and over again defended them without any cross-examination, which is not his job. He has proven himself to be inept, incapable, and incompetent in handling this case, which is why we have called for an independent prosecutor early on. This is a case that also proves why we cannot have any police reform bill that does not deal fully with qualified immunity, because any bill without it is not a good bill. It's not a part of a loaf. There's no bill at all, because too much of this is in the way. Now, this DA showed the clips people have seen. The man was shot in the back of the head. There was no weapons found. They brought a tactical unit into a school district and a residential zone. You can see the officer shooting him from the back on the tapes that we have seen. No one's seen the full tapes, not the family, not the family's lawyers, not the Attorney General of the state, and no one else. In addition, Charles, the DA said today that they could not let him go, as though a warrant means dead or alive. He misquoted a Supreme Court case. He's a really bad lawyer, and I'm not even a lawyer, but listening to him today, where he tried to use a legal case where there had been this chase at 100 miles an hour, 2 officers had been hit, cars had been wrecked and whatnot, to justify them shooting this young man in the back. And then he's trying to make it like, he was this drug dealer. He was well, even if that's so, we arrested Al Capone. We arrested so many people. This is no justification for shooting someone in the back. But some people out there ask this question, why, and it's going to come out, I believe, why was this young man willing to back his car up and take off with all of those police there? Why did they send a tactical unit from 2 different counties? This is Eastern North Carolina. And let me tell you something else he said, Charles, that your audience should look. He said in that press conference, if you don't like my conclusion, he basically said there's nothing you can do, but at the ballot box you can vote me out. That's Southern arrogance. Because there is something we can do. You can have federal review. The FBI is still investigating. That was just him and the FBI report, which we've had problems with the FBI reports in North Carolina forever. We've had cases in North Carolina where an officer was found, was charged and then acquitted. So he's saying there's no recourse. That's not true. You have an FBI investigation going on. We're calling for a pattern and practice with the NAACP and others to come in. That the Justice Department must come in on this, because here's a dangerous precedent. This man is saying justifies killing. It is a license to kill, not a warrant to arrest.
Right. I mean, it really does to me just point to an overall problem with the system, literally unable to police itself. A bigger issue of how race intersects with policing in this area and across the country. In the last segment, I asked Representative Jim Clyburn about why he said America was not a racist country. He said that there are pockets of racism in America. I want you to listen to my follow-up question that I asked him after he said that. Well, let's talk about something that's not really a pocket, though. There are now 40-plus states that are introducing voter restriction legislation. And in April, you told CNN about these restrictions, particularly the one in Georgia. You said, just look through it and look throughout history, and you will know that what is taking place today is a new Jim Crow. Just that simple. If you have over 40 states trying to enact restrictions that you yourself call the new Jim Crow, how is that country not racist? Because those are not pockets. That's 4/5 of the country.
Charles, anybody who gets elected to the legislature can introduce a piece of legislation. There are a lot of racists throughout the country. They can introduce what they want. You can't stop people from introducing, but you can stop it from becoming law. So it's only passed in 2 states, and the 3rd state is looking at it. So I stand by what I said. If a racist gets elected to the legislature, that racist can introduce any bill that he or she wants to introduce. And that's what is happening. Yes, 47 states. You've introduced this legislation. Now look at Arizona, where it's been introduced. Now all of a sudden, a bunch of Republicans today are coming out against what they're doing, calling it a sham, calling the whole thing, because they have now mustered up enough nerve to speak out against it. So just because it gets introduced doesn't mean a thing.
Reverend Barber, what do you think about this idea that racism in America is just pockets of racism, that is not as widespread as we would think, that, even if you have 40 states where legislation has been introduced to restrict the ballot, that it's not racist, that we keep seeing these cases of police killing black and brown men and women popping up all over the country, but somehow the country gets to escape the appellation of race, or being racist.
Well, Charles, I come from a state where we fought a racist voter suppression law, and even the Roberts Court had to agree that it was surgical racism. I come from a state where even in the eastern part of the state, I can name 5 black men who were charged with murders that they didn't commit, two or three on death row. It took us years to get them off. There was 2 that just got off day before yesterday after 31 years. We don't have pockets of racism. We have a problem with racism. It's in John Chapman, who criticized the founders of the country, said that the issue of racism and slavery is always like a snake underneath the table waiting to strike. I respect Congressman Clyburn, but when I heard him say we tolerated slavery and slavery was only in certain parts of the country, no, it wasn't. Slavery was the law of the land. There was a 3/5 compromise as a part of that. The Electoral College, rose out of that 3/5 compromise. It was tolerated in the land when we chose certain states territories being in the Union over other people's humanity. It was 250 years and then another 100 years of Jim Crow. If we were just a pocket of racism, we wouldn't need a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act and fair housing laws and anti-discrimination laws and anti-lynching laws. We wouldn't need, what you basically do is just move all that away. And it's not that one person introduces, they're being introduced, they're being passed, and they're being introduced by majorities because of racist voter suppression and racist gerrymandering. We cannot say it's just pockets. That is to demean the struggle that we face. America has a problem with systemic racism that she has yet to deal with. And I could point out so many other things that we don't even talk about as racism. But they are racist.
Bishop Barber, I'm almost out of time, but I want to make sure that I ask you about Joe Manchin continuing to stand in the way of the $15, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. You guys, your group met with him months ago about this issue. He still opposed it. He made jokes about Bernie Sanders introducing the bill with a $15 minimum wage. Joe Biden talked about it again today. He again today said it's too high. He's thinking more of $11 minimum wage. What do you think about this?
His own constituencies, 350,000 of them that work for less than a living wage in West Virginia, many of them white, said he's wrong on this. And by the way, this stance against 15 is another form of systemic racism. Because if you were to pass $15 right now, it would lift over 40% of people of color, African Americans, out of poor, poverty, and low-wage jobs. That's what racism is, disparate treatment. It has a negative impact. And now he's talking about he wants to possibly pass the Voting Rights Act, but not pass H.R. 1. Here's another problem with that, Charles. What kind of Voting Rights Act? Because there were some Democrats, I think Clyburn was one of them, and some Republicans that came up with a compromise a few years ago where they wanted to pass a new Voting Rights Act. But guess what, y'all? They only wanted to include Georgia and Texas. Of all the 40 states, they said we can pass something, we can get something, but the only states that will be immediately covered would be Georgia and Texas. Not even Mississippi, not even Alabama, not even North Carolina. This is the kind of weak legislating, just getting something to get something that is just wrong. And man, we got to watch him now. This play he's trying to make to suggest he's against 15, hurting his own people, but also he's not saying I'm for possibly the Voting Rights Act being restored. But what does he mean by that? Because a weak Voting Rights Act is as bad in some way as no Voting Rights Act at all. And we can talk about that later when we come to that.
Right. Bishop Barber, I'm out of time, but thank you so much for your time. We have to have you back. I could talk to you all night. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.